Hey guys, John here. This week is all about pads, and for today's video, we're going to be in pigments, and we're going to slightly approach this differently. So here we go. Here's the pads that we're going to be talking about today. Okay, so let's get into this, and today we're not necessarily going to recreate this one-to-one. I'm going to put the patch up regardless, but I think a certain way to talk about pads is going to probably help you a little bit better. So we should start off with the philosophy of pads, right? So before we even start thinking of making a pad, we kind of have to know where we're going, right? Because I know some people create pads and or patches, and they're like, okay, let me just twist knobs until I eventually find something that sounds good. And yes, you can do that, absolutely. But I think going for a more targeted kind of a roadmap of where you want to go for the sound that you're trying to get is a little bit better because you're going to yield better results, right? You're not just going to be like, oh, stumble on happy accents all the time. Not to say that that doesn't necessarily happen, but I think long story short, we should have a roadmap or an idea of where we want to go before we even start making pads, right? Or really any sound for that matter. But pads, I think people struggle with because there's a couple things that we really have to remember when we're making pads. So first things first, we kind of have to think what are pads for, right? So for the most part, they're kind of there to fill some empty spots in a track or to kind of glue things together a little bit. For the most part, they're not necessarily right up in your face like a lead is, or maybe like a big bass or some kind of ARP. They're kind of there supporting the other elements of the track. So with that being said, we kind of have to think, okay, what is our track? What kind of pad do we want, right? Do we want something kind of low end like this? Right, kind of keeping the bottom end of the frequencies to kind of give room for maybe some lead or some stuff up there in the mid or highs? Or do we want something kind of focused on the mids and other stuff built around that? Or do we have basically a full built out track and we kind of just need some sprinkle stuff on the top, the kind of an airy type of pad thing? So that's kind of the first process we have to go for. So what frequency range are we targeting? And sometimes the pad could be almost the whole track. So in that sense, you're targeting everything, which this one is kind of like that, right? So we have those lows that we just heard, and we also have some of these highs. And which is why we have this cutoff as well. So if we crank this to the top here, we're going to have quite a big space of the spectrum here. And so moving on from that, generally here's a couple guidelines for pads that I always kind of try to follow, right? So you kind of have to, I guess, know these guidelines and know when to break them, when to kind of lean into them a little bit more. So for the most part, pads are going to have slower attacks and release than really, leads or basses or stuff like that. And then these two things I think are one of the most important things for pads is one is change over time, right? Because we're holding something down, like pads are supposed to be played for kind of a while, so they have to stay interesting. If it was just a droning sound that didn't change or didn't move, it would be kind of boring, and I think our ears would start to tune those out. And also, not only just change over time, but also change over the stereo field. And adding a lot of little things to a pad can make it sound a lot bigger in the end, right? A tiny 1,000 little screws kind of turns out to be one big thing. So with that being said, I kind of want to walk through this patch for you and kind of show the process and kind of some cool tricks that you might have not known. Okay, so first thing, we're going to be here in the synthesizer. Let's turn off our effects so that's kind of distracting. So this patch itself is both going to be using granular synthesis. So these are both going to be samples. And I find especially in pigments, these two samples kind of complement each other. The hull breach, which if you click this here, it's going to be granular friendly. It's hull breach. I really like that sample for granular stuff. And then kind of having a more melodic sound of this choir, this ooh C3, which you click this here, and it's going to be in the vocals category down here. And it's this one here, choir ooh C3. So those two in combination are kind of cool, right? So if we turn off the utility and the sample and kind of look at this first one, right? So this is the hull breach. So this is kind of more so a texture kind of, I say like 70% texture, 30% melodic, because you can play some melodies. But it's kind of more setting the atmosphere, right? Kind of setting the environment of stuff like that. So it's not too crazy for this patch. We turn on granular, and some of the things I kind of changed a little bit, increasing on this volume, a little bit more density, and then we have some slight pitch variation, which kind of makes things a little bit more interesting. And this one's kind of just there. Right? The only thing that we do change here is the start position, right? So if we hover over this here, we have random one kind of changing the start. So anytime we hit a note, this line is going to hit a new spot. So this is also kind of piggybacking off the idea change over time. So every new note that we hit, it's going to play a different spot in the sample, right? And the grains are going to follow this playhead, which is very helpful, because if it starts from the same spot every time, it's going to eventually get kind of boring. So moving on from this guy, let's go to the second sample, and this is that choir ooh-ah, or ooh. And that's bringing the melodic sound, the melody, the soul, the heart, the longing, the pain, and all that to us. That's the soul in that sense. So we're kind of combining environments with soul. I mean, depending on what pad we're doing, but this is kind of the thought process for this guy. And we're doing the same thing here for this start as well, but we're using random too, so it's not necessarily going to be using the same random modulator here. It's going to be different and a different depth here. So 0.25. And similar to with the granular, right? So we turn on a granular. This one, I didn't change any of the volume stuff. It kind of is what it is. But on this one, now that I'm looking at it, we do have the direction back and forth in the middle. So it's 50% forwards, 50% backwards for that. So over here, there's not really any crazy changes of tuning. It's kind of all on zero as far as the both of them go. But this one I did add unison, and we're doing 2 voices, so just a little bit more to kind of stereoize it some more. And even just using this sample with the rest of the effects can be fine as well. You don't necessarily need this other one here, but I think it kind of adds to the whole texture of the sound. Makes it a little bit more interesting, and we can always bring down the volume if we want the environment to be a little bit tucked under the melody. But that's just the thought process. That's kind of more of the patch mixing thing that you can do a little bit later on. So yeah, so that's these two, how they kind of work. So this is kind of setting one, the environment, and then two, the melodic sound, and kind of bridging the gap between those two. Next up here, if we go to the utility engine, this one's interesting because this is a couple things that I think are kind of cool. So especially with pads, right, and we're going to be using a lot of effects, we're sending them for reverbs, delays, and all that. What happens is the low end starts to kind of suck, right? All the effects get to the low end and it gets muddy, and if you're playing a lot of chords and stuff, it kind of sounds gross and just not really targeted. So what I generally do is I use, as you probably know by now, I use the extra oscillator down here in the utility engine and send this direct out and put that on a macro, which is this guy down here. So if we're ever playing this, let's turn on this vocal here. We have basically clean low end. However, if we turn that off, this is basically what the pad's doing by itself. Here, we're kind of only really targeting the mids, maybe a slight bit of lower mids, kind of, but more so the mids and the highs, the clarity, what our ears are more sensitive to. The little low end down there, and basically what we're kind of trying to avoid is the interference, phase cancellation, stuff with effects kind of just interfering with the low end, because you want the low end to be solid and also able to bring it in and out if you want to. If you wanted more of an airy pad, we can drop this sub down here. Play a little higher up, and then there we go. We have something that fits our track, so that's something to keep in mind. And then we can bring in our sub. It's going to be clean. So that's another important thing right there. The next thing we should talk about is, if we turn this off here, is some of the change over time, right? So when we play this pad, we want different things to happen, right? We have our environment, our melody, our low end sub, but that's not all. We also want different things. So if we take a look at the second analog noise, this is kind of doing this weird thing. Let's kind of turn this up here. It's kind of quiet now, so this is 0.22, so I'll bring it up and kind of exaggerate this. Right, it's just a function attached to this volume knob that really, you wouldn't probably notice it if it were there, but it still just adds to all these other things kind of building this patch up. Kind of makes things interesting. So if we turn these kind of on here, we can kind of hear it. It's almost like, is there something there? Maybe. And if we add a couple of those things like that in there, it kind of makes things a little bit more interesting. So that's one of those kind of tiny things that you can always add to pads to make them a little more interesting. And then next up, we have just this regular noise. Let's turn these guys off here. And then this adds as well to the environment, because it's not necessarily we're doing a tonal thing. It's more of an environmental thing. And we're doing a little bit of a high pass on this at 22%, in case you're making this as well. So yeah, that's the thought process for this. So once we have everything going together, what's happening is that we're sending it through this first filter, and I find the Jupiter 8, especially on a 12, is kind of nice. It's a subtle filter. The resonance can sound good, and so these two are going to be on macros, right? So this cutoff, this first macro is going to be on the cutoff, as we see, about 0.43%, and then the resonance is going to be macro 2. And this cutoff is also getting modulated by a couple of things, right? So we have our macro, which is the blue guy, and then we have our envelope 2, which is envelope, this orange guy. So if we look at the second envelope, it's kind of similar following the amplitude, right? So we have the slow attack for the amplitude, 3.11 seconds. The decay is 2.55 seconds, and then the sustain is a little bit, right? So 0.892, and then the release about 2.57 seconds. So kind of interesting. And then the second envelope is kind of following that. Not exactly, because we don't want the envelopes to be exactly matched, because then that's going to be boring. That's why I used a second one on this as opposed to the first one, because they're similar, but also they have those little differences, and I think those do make a difference. The curvature as well, and this is kind of more of a personal thing for me. I do like bringing this attack curve more concave, and then the release more convex. I think it sounds a little bit better and a little smoother. And then the other thing we have here is an LFO1, so a very small change, right? So this is another thing of the change over time, right? We have LFO1 at 0.04. If we take a look at this guy, it's going very, very slow. You see this little dot just kind of moving around here, and this is subtly just moving the filter open and close very slowly over time. So no matter what key we press or how long we hold it, the filter is always going to be moving, right? It first opens up with our attack phase, and then it starts to decay, and it holds at our sustain spot. But even when it's holding at our sustain spot, this LFO is still slowly moving it. And then once we release our keys, then it enters the release phase, and then there we go. While the envelope or this LFO is still actually moving that, so that's very cool. So next up, we're sending the output of this filter into the second one, this multi-mode, and this is just a high pass, and we're cutting off 173 hertz, which once we add all this texture, the voice, the interesting stuff, the utility engine, the low end starts to get gross, and we're kind of just tapering that off. It's a gentle one here at 6, right? So we're not doing something like a too crazy cut. You can change that if you'd like, but that's kind of the thought process, right? We're getting our main core sound and our mid, maybe a little bit of our lower mid, our high range, and then cutting off the low end, and then bringing that low end back with the sub oscillator, but a clean version of that. So before we even get into effects, another kind of thing I want to talk about is here on the voice pan. So if we bring this down here, we're on random 2, right? And let's take a look at random 2. So this is a sample and hold, and a sample from the white noise, and it's triggered from our keyboard. So every time we hit a different note, we get a different value, and that different value is translating to the voice pan. So this is the change over the stereo field, right? It's not really exactly at the same spot every single time. So as I'm hitting that note, it kind of, sometimes it's a little bit more on the left, sometimes it's a little bit more on the right. It kind of just moves back and forth. And that's really cool. We can do a little bit of value. We don't want to do something too hardcore left and right panning, because that'll kind of throw us off. But this just makes it interesting, right? So we don't know exactly where it's going to land in the stereo field. We don't know exactly where it's going to be in the frequency spectrum. So there's all these variables slowly changing the sound. So that's another kind of thing I like to do as well. It's an alternate thing. That's what most synthesizers call it, but we're basically using a random to do the same concept there. Okay, so now it gets fun with some of the effects here. So we turn these on, and the bottom two are just reverb, so I guess we'll turn these off for now. So this first FXA is kind of interesting, right? We have a EQ into a delay and then to a chorus. So this EQ, We're just doing a little bit of this kind of removing, what frequency do you have here? 158, right? So just a little bit of whatever is left over from that filter. But this is interesting. So take a look at this band right over here. So this is the third band, and we have a little bit of a spike, and the resonance is kind of tight. Now, this is kind of just emulating this change over time, right? As we're playing something, we have kind of swooshes and whooshes kind of going back and forth. And if we take a look at this guy, we're modulating this with random 3. So if we look at random 3, which is this guy here, sample and hold, sample from the white noise, so we don't really know what value it's going to land on. And then we're also using this rise and fall, right? And we're using this as a linked thing. So whenever it gets a trigger to move, it's not going to be an instant jump. It's going to slightly move. You see how like every time this guy moves, it's going to be slow. It's going to be kind of accelerating. It's not a jumpy motion. It just keeps slowly moving. And that curvature is where we add this rise and fall with this linking thing here. So now we have a retrigger source. So we have to tell this random when are we going to trigger this to get a different value to move this little guy over here. And we chose LFO2. So that's really all LFO2 is doing in this sense. It's a trigger for this random that moves this guy. And this guy here is free running, so it's always moving, right? And it's always going to be at a very slow value, so 0.170, because we don't want this thing always triggering. It's a subtle thing. It happens every so often. So every time this crosses these zero crossings, it's going to trigger, and it's going to fire, and it's basically going to send this information to this random to start moving, right? So if you kind of follow it here, we can always see where it's going to go, and then it's going to trigger this guy. So if we bring our cutoff here, we can kind of listen to what this is sounding like. And that's more so going to be focused on the mid higher end stuff. So once this cutoff is completely open, then you're going to notice that a little bit more. If it's kind of ducked down over here, we're not going to really hear it too much. So that's the cool part, is once we increase this cutoff, we start getting more frequencies, and then we start revealing this guy over here, which is kind of a nice little trick to do. So in case it's kind of hard to hear, let's get this guy and kind of really boost this a lot. So this is at 5 dB. So if we did something kind of massive, that's the kind of effect that we're going for, but obviously very exaggerated. So we kind of need to tuck this guy back down to about 5 dBs, and that should be kind of okay. It's a subtle thing. And keep in mind, you can do this with a couple more bands or more EQs. That's just the concept I think is really cool for pads and kind of that change over time thing. So then we send this to a delay to kind of obviously delay it, but also make the sound a little bit bigger. So once you let our keys go, we have some delays kind of filling up that empty space that's kind of going back and writing the release curve. Which isn't too crazy. We're just adding a decent amount at 34%. We aren't changing the fine because I think the fine is a very cool knob to change because the delays aren't going to be exact every single time. You have that little bit of differences between the field, which is very nice. And then nothing too crazy. We're cutting some lows and some highs, and yeah, not too intense there. Next up, we go into just a basic chorus, which kind of thickens the sound up a little bit more. Right, nothing too crazy. I think, do we have all of our stuff on? We do. Let's turn on these two again. Missing that low end. And we hear that almost that modulation of that noise, which also increases once we increase the cutoff. So we're getting this EQ band here and that this noise that we have here. So as the cutoff increases, not only are we getting more frequencies, but we're getting a more interesting patch. Okay, so last but not least. Yeah, geez, these sayings sometimes I forget them. Oh my God. Okay, so we're using a combination of shimmer and reverb, which are pretty much both reverbs. So if we turn this guy on, let's turn keep our first shimmer on. Sometimes a shimmer reverb makes things a little bit more ethereal. Now, in this, we're increasing the modulation a little bit, increasing the ducking, because we kind of want to get a little bit of the reverb out of the way while we're playing some notes, so it's a little bit more clear. And then we're also setting that again into another reverb. What I do like about shimmers on pads is it kind of makes them sound either a little bit more ethereal, if that's the kind of sound you're going for, or you can bring the pitching down to maybe like -1 semitones or a little bit more and get almost a creepy, dissonant vibe, especially if you increase so we go down here to the grains, and if we increase this random pitch here, it's going to make it a little bit more detuned, and then you add that with the with the shimmer, make it more, I guess, a detuned reverb, and then also do that with the delay, and kind of have the pitch kind of change up and down. That's really how you get dissonance. So here it's just kind of more ethereal and kind of pretty. And then this last reverb is just kind of carrying everything at the very end and kind of just reverberating that. And here we go. That's pretty much the concept here. So you don't necessarily have to remake this exact patch. If you want it, there's a link in the video description below for sure. But really the takeaway for this video is kind of just going for those different concepts, right? The change over time is very important, right? If we play one chord and that's the only chord that we need, we should have it be a little bit more interesting, right? Things moving, opening filters, opening and closing, maybe the resonance kind of moving, maybe put an LFO also on the resonance so the resonance always slightly moves. Always change the start and end time if you're doing sample-based stuff or granular-based stuff. That's always helpful. And kind of just look around the synth and say, like, what can we slowly move to make things a little bit more interesting? Maybe you can put an LFO on this D2 knob for the unison and kind of move that slowly. That might be kind of cool. Or, I mean, really anything. There's so much stuff you can modulate inside of Pigments that there's kind of the sky's the limit in that sense. And also keep in mind, doing creative stuff with the effects, like with this EQ, kind of moving this almost like a wind, kind of moving back and forth. Because I kind of approach it as, okay, we have a pad. If we're doing kind of environment stuff, we can have this setting the room where this pad is kind of taking place, right? And then also the melodics that kind of hybrid and kind of mesh those two together. And that's that type of pad. And even in this case right here, so our cutoff's all the way at the top, and if we just play one chord, it should sound somewhat interesting and not the same every single time. So even though it's static, it's still kind of moving a little bit more. And this is more on the subtle end. In different pads or different patches, you can go a little bit more, add more of that modulation, maybe increase this this gain a little bit more, stuff like that. So that's kind of the philosophy of pads, right? So whereas normally we teach every single knob and slider, and that's cool because we can recreate that pad and use it for whatever we want it to. But I hope this kind of concept makes your pads a little bit easier to make, right? Just focus on those kind of core things. And generally 9 times out of 10, you're going to get a cool pad, and then you're going to start being like, oh, I can modulate the modulator that modulates the whoever knows what, that makes things interesting. So that is kind of the concept. So hopefully that's a little bit helpful to make pads a little bit easier for you to make. And yeah, that about wraps us this video. Thank you for watching, and yeah, see you in the next video.